Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, it's the first of a two-part conversation in our series Where Are We Going?, which looks at some of the biggest questions, and this is maybe about the biggest question of all. I'm talking to the political scientist and writer Ivan Krastev, one of the most prolific and interesting commentators on the contemporary political imagination. And we're discussing the idea of the future. How do we conceive it? How do we imagine it? What do we do if we don't believe in it anymore? The first of two conversations about the past, present, and future of the idea of the future. As you will hear, Ivan Krastev was in Vienna when we recorded this conversation. I'm in Cambridge, England. Ivan spent some of his time in Vienna, some in Sofia in Bulgaria. He is Bulgarian. This is a wide-ranging conversation. It touches on and alludes to a lot of different things. I'm hoping that most of them will be familiar to most people. But one name that comes up at the end that may not be familiar, may be hard to catch, is that of Alexander Kojève, a very interesting and unusual 20th century Russian-born French philosopher who was part of the inspiration for Fukuyama's idea of the end of history. Kojève was also interesting and unusual for a philosopher in that he was also pretty much a full-time civil servant, a French civil servant, and he devoted much of his career to laying the groundwork for the creation of the European Union, which was one version of his understanding of the end of history. So the name that you will hear at the end is that of Alexander Kojève. Here's the conversation. Ivan, we're going to be talking about the history of the idea of the future, which sounds often to people like a slightly weird thing, that the future has a history, but of course it does. Partly because human beings haven't always framed how they understand the present through an idea of the future. It's probably quite a recent phenomenon. Do you think basically it's a distinctly modern idea? Is actually this one of the ways we should think about what modernity is? Modernity is the moment when human beings thought the present needs to be interpreted through our idea of what's coming next.
People are, in my view, not distinguishing between our interest of what is going to happen tomorrow. And this is kind of eternal interest. You go to the oracle, you're asking, and you go for a fortune teller, and you hope that you're going to know. But this is not the future. And from this point of view, the idea of the future is based on something different than the idea that there is a tomorrow, which is different than today. Unlike traditional societies in which the idea of society was very much based on analogy with man. You grow, you age, you die, you're reborn, and you have this cyclical idea of history. So both past and future are things that are twins, because they're coming, they're going. You much more think in terms of rise and fall than a day of the future. And then comes modernity, and modernity defines the future very differently. First, future is a time which is radically different from our own time. In a strange way, this is a time that you cannot be sure that you can grasp from the perspective of today. Secondly, future is open. We don't know how this is going to look like because it very much depends how we're going to act on this. And thirdly, and for me this is very important, future is a project. So in a certain way, future is this next very different time and very different societies that we want to build. And as a result of it, future is a different projects. And these projects can go in a very different directions. But all of them share this idea of future as different from the past. It is open, this is unknown, and it very much depends what we want and how we are going to act. I do believe from this point of view, a future is particularly modern concept, and the very idea of modernity is based on the fact that this is a temporal regime, which is very much centered on the idea of the future.
As you say, in pre-modern understandings of how time works, past and future, as you put it, are twins. You can't really separate them out, and they mirror each other in various ways. And you think about your descendants and your ancestors as having a very symbiotic relationship, and you may be in the flow of time, but these two things balance each other out. And as you've just said, the modern conception assumes a break, the future is different, but there is also this idea of progress, so that even though it's not mirroring the past, there is a direction of travel. The past flows through the present to a future, and you can track it as a kind of progress. Also, a distinctly modern idea. Do you think modern conceptions of the future and the idea of progress are necessarily bound together? Are there modern conceptions of the future which are not progressive?
It is interesting because when it comes to technology, the idea of a progress is not contested. And from this point of view, if before we have the idea of the historical cycle, now the time is perceived as an error that goes from the past to the future. But Rousseau was probably one of those who very early on asked the question, is the technological progress also the moral progress? And then you're going to end up with two very different positions. One is saying that the more technologies develop, the more modern our life is, the more progressive our life is, the better our societies are. But then you have this very strong nostalgia for the primitive. And you can see it both on the left and on the right. On the left, this is very much connected to the idea of equality, to the idea that in these primitive societies we were much more equal, which were before private property, before family, before state. But then on the right, you have the idea of community and tradition. And as a result of it, while progress is perceived as very much progressing in terms of consumption, or in terms of industrial development, it could be seen as destroying communities, making people much more lonely, much more unhappy. So yes, we have the idea of progress being very important, but future does not need to be a moral progress. And this is why the different projects of the future are very much focusing on this. They come from a different value perspective.
Is then the danger, in a way, of these modern conceptions of the future that the idea of technological progress feels like it's baked in? In some sense, it's baked in. Of course, we're going to come on to the ways in which that then becomes dystopian, but certainly in modernity, for most of its history, the idea that technological progress means more goods, more opportunities, greater comforts, that feels part of the story. Moral progress is much more contested. And then somewhere between the two is political progress. Political progress, which has an economic, technological component, and it clearly also has a moral component. It sometimes feels like the history of modernity is actually the collapsing of these things together in the political space, where I think you're implying we need to separate them out.
There is also one thing about thinking about the future as a project. Who is thinking about this and project for whom? I remember in Bulgaria, it was 1980s, I was totally fascinated by the problem of utopias, but particularly by one issue. And this was why in Thomas More's Utopia, this perfect society that we're talking about, the inhabitants of this perfect society were not Christians. Thomas More was a very devoted Christian thinker. How it happened that in this kind of a perfect societies, they were not Christians? And I was thinking a lot, and of course, part of the answers that I was trying to present to myself could be wrong. But the story of trying to think about the future is quite often you think not only about your own future, but the future of others. And from this point of view, Thomas More's Utopia very much was written in the moment when the great geographical discoveries were underway. And suddenly you have the idea to experiment. What is the best society? And you cannot experiment with other Christians. The only way to experiment basically is the people on the other side of the ocean, which was just discovered and with which you can try and check what is working, what is not working, what is a good society, what is not good society. So in my view, this double nature of utopia, this is the best society, but for whom? And who have the right to experiment with whom? Is critically important also about this moral ambiguity. Because the moment you decide that your project is not simply a technological progress, but also a moral progress, That gives you the possibility to do things which otherwise people are not going to allow you to do on them.
And you're going to do things to people who are alive now for the sake of people who are not yet alive.
And this is critically important because these other people can be people living in different geographies, like in the time of the great geographical discoveries, but it could be also people living in the future time. So we're doing this for the next generations, and particularly the communist utopia was very much a sacrifice for the next generations. From this point of view, one of the interesting thinkers in this is a very strange and marginal Russian religious philosopher from the end of the 19th century, Nikolai Fyodorov, who basically wrote a book on the common task. And he said, listen, if the future society is this perfect socialist society and the next generations are going to live in this perfect society, what about the past generation? Is it something, not a huge inequality that we are building a great society for the future generations, but what about the past? And then he comes with his utopian vision that the major task of every person is to resurrect his parents, and the technology should help us to do this. And he really was so much involved in thinking about this that he starts to say, but there are going to be too many people in the world, so we should be able to go to another planet. And some of his followers invested so much into this that paradoxically, the beginning of the Soviet space program comes from one of the followers of Fyodorov, who basically was very much kind of bothered of the fact that when we're going to resurrect the dead, we should go to other places. So from this point of view, this religious idea that we are going to be alive at one and the same time on the Judgment Day, and the idea that we need this progress society which is morally perfect for everybody, this is also the clash between generations, the clash between geographies, and I do believe this is so strongly embedded in the political contradictions of modernity.
Because there is that other, in some ways, more secular version of that argument, which is about discounting the future and the anxiety that many quote unquote progressives have, which is that we are prioritizing the present over the future. So, for instance, we are squandering the resources of the planet and not thinking about future generations. And the argument there is, to what extent can we discount the value of their lives relative to the value of people who are existing today? It's almost like the mirror of that argument. One version of it is we're going to resurrect our parents and our grandparents, and we need a planet to live with them on. The other is we are so selfish, we're not progressive enough. We're so selfish that we think our needs are more important than the needs of people who might be born in 100 years' time. And the idea of the future is the thing that animates both of those arguments. You don't worry about those things if you're not thinking the present has to be defined in terms of the future. But if you are thinking like that, it can go both ways. You worry that you're being selfish relative to the people who are dead, and you worry you're being selfish relative to the people who aren't born yet.
Our idea of the future means that it's a society different than our own. So theoretically, for us, it's going to be impossible to experience what it means to live in a society like this, because it could be transformative experience. They're going to be people different than us. They're going to have a different political preferences. They're going probably to have a different moral preferences. But at the same time, we try to construct our life as if allowing them to be the architects of what is happening today. And I do believe that this kind of a present regulated by the future, or on the other side, present regulated by the past, also creates a certain type of a crisis of the very idea of the present moment in which we are living. The Bulgarian novelist Georgy Gospodinov, who got a Booker Prize some years ago, has a short story which is called Blind Aisha. And Blind Aisha is a story of a girl who was born with a very particular defect. Her left eye can see only the past, and her right eye can see only the future. So when she was meeting somebody, and particularly when she went into the romantic age to try to look for a partner, she was seeing either a child that the present person was, or an old man that he's going to be. And she was struggling so much with this that at the end of the story, she decided to get blind, believing that being blind makes it easier for her to live. And I do believe from this point of view, this focusing on the future, focusing on the past, makes it really very difficult to experience the present as a distinct time.
Do you think this is pushing that line of thought possibly to its logical conclusion? But do you think that because the future doesn't exist, it does not exist in the present, as you said, we can't live in the future because by the time we're there, it's the present. And as you mentioned, utopian thinking in modern thought, starting with Thomas More, is the idea of a place that doesn't exist. So it could be a kind of geographical conception, it's on the other side of the world, but it can also be a futurist conception. That there is actually something inherently utopian or dystopian about all of our modern thinking. I mean, as soon as we embark on the project to define the present in terms of the future, since the future doesn't exist, QED, even if we think we're realists, even if we think we're pragmatists, even if we think we're social democrat progressives who don't have fantastical Marxist ideas, we are still at some level, all of us, utopians.
Because listen, in the traditional society, and of course this was very much based on the idea of change was taking place in the societies, we believed that our parents were not very different than us. That's why we never had the feeling that we cannot understand them. And we don't believe that our children are very different than us, so we don't believe that we can also advise them all the time what to do. And then the change starts to accelerate. And suddenly, both your parents and your children becoming difficult to understand for you, totally not transparent for you. They start to look like a different species. And I do believe that this kind of utopian nature of modernity, it is not coming at every single model, but we are experiencing it now more than it was experienced before. And modernity basically is revealing many of the contradiction and hidden assumptions on which it was based.
That idea of how we can't understand our parents, can't understand our children, being itself a historical phenomenon. We just did an episode about Annie Ernaux's The Years, which seems to me to be the definitive, it's not a fiction, it's a sort of auto-fiction, but autobiographical fictional account of that experience, but dates it, and it dates it in the 1950s and the early 1960s, a France in which that continuity existed, and suddenly the future just crashed in about 1954 in the form of consumer goods. It arrived in the form of consumer goods. The talk around the dinner table at the Sunday lunches with the family had been in the late 1940s, all anchored in history, shared experiences of the war, the First World War, the Paris Commune, the revolution. And within a decade, all the talk was about a new television set, a new car, and suddenly the generational ties were broken, for better and for worse. I'm not, you can be nostalgic for that, or you can think of it as a liberation. It was a liberation, but nonetheless, it happened at a very particular moment in time.
There was this Norwegian crime series called Beforeigners. And I don't believe it's a particularly great movie, but I do believe this is a particularly interesting hypothesis. So imagine that there are boats arriving on the Norwegian coast, but they're not people coming from a different places, but Norwegians coming from a different times. They're Viking comings and they're 19th century Norwegians coming and so on. So suddenly I do believe after 1950s, and we can see it more and more now, you have the feeling that our societies are populated by people who are different in a different time regimes. And they're living in one and the same house, and they have a totally different experience of time. And this is, by the way, very much seen today in politics. One of the things when we talk about fragmentation, one of the major fragmentation is fragmentation of time. If you're listening, for example, to President Trump, he speaks in weeks. Anything that he's going basically to do, or basically he's planning, is going to happen in 2 weeks or 3 weeks. Suddenly, the historical times can collapse to the individual life of one person, very powerful person. You go on the other side to the Russian President Putin, and he's going to go to the 9th century archives to decide to invade Ukraine or not. And as the joke goes, the only person that he consulted was Peter the Great, Ivan the Terrible, and Ekaterina the Great, suddenly living in centuries. I do believe that exactly because our idea of present, past, and future have been so destabilized by this acceleration, that this type of a different temporal regime starts to coexist, in my view, in a very kind of a dangerous way. We are not inhabiting the same time.
One of the other distinctive features of the Trump version of that politics is that because he changes his mind so often, so the last month has been a good example of this in relation to the Iran war. Yesterday, he said they were going to do a deal. Today, he says, I'm going to bomb them to the Stone Age. Tomorrow, he says they're going to do a deal again. What that means is that yesterday is suddenly a long time ago. So the future has shrunk much closer to our immediate time horizon. But you push yesterday, which traditionally in modern understanding, yesterday is quite recent. You are quite closely connected to yesterday, but not in Trump world. It's as though that constant chopping and changing about what he said yesterday, that was yesterday, today is today, means that yesterday might as well be the 19th century.
And you cannot remember it. When you're going to destroy it, you cannot remember it. And this should be opposed to, for example, what the Soviet regime was doing. Soviet regime, in order basically to keep a certain line to the future, should rewrite the past all the time. The famous kind of remaking the photographs to getting Trotsky out of the photos of the leaders of the revolution, because the idea is that nothing is accidental and everything is very much pre-designed, and the past goes to the future directly. So future has a very certain past. So if you want to reach the future, you should rewrite the past all the time. And now suddenly, not simply that there is no kind of a long-term future and everything is reversible, but also because of it, there is no past. You cannot remember the yesterday if everything is changing so fast. So from this point of view, this kind of a changing experience of time, particularly time in politics, is one of the most important characteristics of the period in which we are living. So when people talk about revolution, normally they talk about the end goal, where you want to go. But in a strange way, the revolution to a great extent is the change of pace, of change. And what you are saying now is the speed is overwhelming in the age of Trump. So the speed is so overwhelming that direction does not matter.
I'm always skeptical of people who want to say of Trump that he's created an Orwellian world, because I don't think it is particularly Orwellian. But there is the celebrated line from 1984, which was inspired by exactly what you say, the classic Soviet technique of erasing people from the photographs. Winston Smith's job in 1984 is to rewrite yesterday's newspapers because we were at war with this entity and now we're at war with this entity. And the famous line is, who controls the past controls the future, who controls the present controls the past. And that does feel to me quite Trumpian.
But do you know, it's interesting because I do believe with Trump there is something which goes deeper. I'm Bulgarian. We are famous for having probably the highest number of fortune tellers per capita. And one of the interesting story when you basically go and talk to these fortune tellers is that they're telling you something about the future because they believe that they are not seeing the past, the present, and the future is very much distinct. In a certain way, they see the future as something that has already happened. For her, the future is already the past. And I had the feeling that there is something particularly about Trump in which distinctions between past, present, and future is not very strong for him. Something that he said or he wanted to say, something that he said yesterday, or something that he's planning to say tomorrow, all of this the whole time is consumed without being divided in these three pieces that are so important for modernity. And I believe this is really interesting because he's not interested in his predecessors, and in my view, he's not interested in his successors. All this idea that he wants to create almost a monarchical regime, it's not him. He believes that we have our lifetime and our lifetime is going to be longer and we're probably going to become immortal. And this is the other thing that I do believe is dramatically changing our idea of time. We talk about politics, which about acceleration of political developments. But in my view, on anthropological level, something very important happened in the last 20 years, not in the 1950s, but already in the 21st century. On one level, you have all this Silicon Valley crowd who start to believe that people, individuals, could be immortal. and they're starting to live as this being their major goal. And this immortality is physical. It's immortality of the body through technology. It's not immortality of the soul. And on the other side, many things that have been our major devices to fight our own mortality suddenly losing meaning. Nations are not perceived, particularly if you're a small nation, as being immortal. So you cannot believe that if you're going to die for the nation, you're going to be remembered in hungry tears. There are too many books being published to believe that if you're going to write a great book, you're going to manage to fight your own mortality. Religion is not what it used to be. So from this point of view, the collapse of the idea of the mortal human, and on the other side, the collapse of the idea of the immortal collectives is something that also, in my view, dramatically affect the way we experience time and the way we do politics.
So I'm going to come on and talk about some of the implications of that, because there's all sorts of things that might come out of that. And we're also living through an astonishing demographic change. The age profile is shifted too. I want to come back to that. But just to connect it to Trump and then to the history that we were talking about, democracy depends on separating out past, present, and future. Representative democracy. I think pure democracy is a very present-centered thing. The Athenians would vote and then tomorrow they would change their mind. But representative democracy has a structure in which the relationship between past, present, and future is really crucial because it turns on elections, and elections presuppose both an accountability for the past and a prospectus for the future. All elections have that aspect to them, two aspects in one, and we can never quite decide which one we're doing. Are we judging them for how they have behaved over the past 4 years, or in Britain, 1 year or even shorter, and in Bulgaria, I think even shorter than that. But there is a time frame. Are we judging them for what they did, or are we judging them for what they're promising? And then the relationship between those two things is a question of judgment for us. Maybe we think we will forgive them for what they did because they're promising us something better, or on the other hand, we won't. If you collapse them in the Trump style, and it's not just him, but that version of politics, do you think there is something fundamentally undemocratic about that? Again, I'm wary of that thing of just saying, Trump is a threat to democracy, Trump is the end of this, is the end of that. But in these terms, if past, present, and future collapse into the present, both accountability and future promises cease to have meaning.
And from this point of view, I do believe that democracy is a very interesting political regime because it managed to reconcile the old idea of the cyclical time with the electoral cycles and the idea of the progressive time with the idea of an open future in which you basically take it for granted and which you're going to have different regimes. So the cyclical time is very important because it allows politicians, political parties, to believe that they have more than one lives. You can lose the elections and you're not losing everything. You can come back, and this is very important because this is the major incentives for you not to try to stay in power forever, even when you have the feeling that people are not very much on your side. But on the other side, this idea that future is open, that we can make mistakes, that we can improve our mistakes, that we can self-correct, is very important for the way democracy works because it means that disappointment with a certain government should not be disappointment with democracy. And from this point of view, I always have believed that democracy has one fundamental advantage with respect to the authoritarian regime is that democracy has a mechanism to deal with individual dissatisfaction, while the authoritarian regimes do not have this. And that comes what you were talking about, the night of the elections. And on the night of the elections, I look back, I look ahead, I made a judgment. This is the night of the elections when I'm voting, is the moment in which I'm not simply staying in the present, but for me, the present is very much related to the past and to the future. But then something important happened, and Trump is important, but Trump, in my view, is just the result of something much more deeper. We don't believe anymore that future is open. And we don't believe that future is open because suddenly, for important groups of our society, if certain decisions are not going to be taken today, tomorrow is going to be too late. If you're a climate activist, you believe that if certain decisions are not going to be taken today, if you're going to come to power in 10 years, it doesn't matter anymore. Because basically, the life on Earth is going to die. And if you're anti-migration activists, you believe that if you're not going to reverse certain trend now, in 10 years it's going to be too late. And this kind of a change of time, in my view, is very much responsible for the polarizing nature of our democracies. So in a certain way, it's not simply that people has a different priorities of what's most important, but their fears of the fact that the future is foreclosed push them to do something, in my view, very important, dramatically increase the intensity of politics. And I do believe that Tocqueville was very good at this, because Tocqueville noticed something that, in my view, very few people have noticed. Democracy you represent on the night of the elections, interest, emotions, values. The one thing that you don't represent is intensity. I who care a lot and you who do not care, both of us has one vote. And our votes are equally powerful. And from this point of view, this is very much de-dramatizing certain things. And this de-dramatization, in my view, is a very important part of democracy. And now when the future is foreclosed, this intensity is pushing for representation. And this is why suddenly the politics is reduced democratic politics to the clash of different Extinction Rebellions.
There's a great chapter in Tocqueville's Democracy in America, which is just called The Election, in which he just describes the arc of an American election. This is in the 1830s, but it's completely familiar. And the arc of it is rising hysteria, essentially. As the election approaches, everybody decides that everything depends on this election. And the newspapers are full of passion and vitriol and hyperbolic claims. It's all or nothing. Every election is the most important election of our lifetimes. And then the day after the election, everyone goes, what was that all about? And on they go. And the difference with our politics is that run up to the election feels completely familiar. I can't remember how many American presidential elections I've been told are the most important election in anyone's lifetime. But that sense of catharsis that it dissipates, that's the thing that doesn't seem still to be present in our democracy. That, as you say, for the people for whom the intensity means genuinely this could be the last election, not because elections will be abolished, but because we'll never get our chance to correct for what's happened. The day after the election, it's almost more intense. So Brexit was the classic case in Britain. The morning after the election was in some ways more intense than the morning before, which is not how it's meant to work in Tocquevillian terms. In Tocquevillian terms, the morning after is when sanity is restored. And the morning after Brexit is when you could feel in the air that we were in for a crazy decade.
But this is very interesting because this is very much about our idea of the future. If future is perceived as genuinely open, you basically see democracy as the art of postponing. Okay, I want to achieve this. And probably it's very sad that it's not going to happen in my generation, but this is going to happen in the next generation, and this is the most important. But I do believe this is the moment when the utopian thinking became dystopian thinking. And when suddenly this kind of a projects were very much replaced by projections. Because this is the difference between the projects of modernity, be it communist projects or fascist projects or any other projects. They go in this future, they're talking about what kind of society they want to build, but they're not exactly telling you when exactly it's going to happen. Khrushchev is the only one who said that 1980 is the moment Soviet Union will become a communist country, but basically nobody took him very literally. So now it's totally different. The idea is that future cannot be taken for granted anymore. You have all these dystopian fears, which are different for different groups of society. And this is why the nature of the elections is dramatically changing. If I'm losing these elections, I'm losing everything. And this living in projections is very important because unlike the projects, projections are perceived as objective reality, as a trend. For example, this is a projection of what is going to be the average temperature on Earth in 50 years. There is a projections of what is going to be the size of the population of the Earth, so about certain country, and probably there are projections of what is going to be the demographic composition of these societies. And I do believe that this shift from project to projections is also what is dramatically changing our view for the future. Plus, the market is doing something interesting. Before, the future was very much kind of a collective project. Then suddenly future was also very much individual project, and in the 1950s, what you're talking about, suddenly because our individual projects became so different, it was so difficult to talk to each other. But now when we talk about future, we are mostly talking about the futures of the stocks, and we can basically trade them. Trading in futures is very popular on the market. So, in a certain way, the only thing that has a future and kind of a future that we can value in very particular moments are certain shares of certain companies.
In Annie Ernaux's The Years, it's very interesting because the 1950s to 60s are this transition from a version of French life in which historical memories shape the present to a version of French life in which the consumer future shapes the present. But it coexists in her telling through 1968, 1981 with a lot of democratic hope, these moments where it felt like the French people could shape their own future. The events of 1968, Mitterrand's first election in 1981, that sense that the future was open. And in her telling, that closed, and I think she almost describes it as happening in the late 90s, watching the news on TV and suddenly noticing that ideas have been replaced by statistics. And this is France, so there were a lot of ideas on TV. The intellectuals had multiple platforms in which to talk about their ideas of the future. And as a French intellectual herself, suddenly noticing what she describes as this completely new phenomenon, which is the news became news of statistical projections of the future. And that was a post 1989 or 1991, or possibly even post 2000 phenomenon. But it shifted the meaning of democracy because suddenly the consumerism was not bound up with ideas of democratic hope, but it was bound up with ideas of economic fatalism.
This is very important because from this point of view, 1989 is an interesting moment because for me, in order to understand what is going on, is interesting to try to see how is we transited from the idea of the end of history to the idea of the end of times. And from this point of view, if you're basically rereading Fukuyama, and in my view, he was slightly misinterpreted because he was read as being totally triumphalist. And this is not true. To be honest, in 1989, 1992, in the West, there was not much of a triumphalism. There was a shock. Something unexpected happened. And of course, on one level, when your enemy is defeated, you like it, but the other, it was such a surprise that you don't believe that you understand anymore what is happening. And it's interesting when you see when the article of Fukuyama was written before the book, it was the spring of 1989. If you read the article, you're going to see that he does not assume that Soviet Union is going to disintegrate. He does not assume that borders are going to be changed. For his, the major argument was no revolution is possible anymore. That's it. For him, there was no universalist alternative. And then when he looks at this consumer world, he was not particularly happy. This was kind of a post heroic world. And for him, the only important question was, are people who are basically succeeding, the heroes of the consumer world, are going to be happy enough of being the heroes of the consumer world? And you remember on the last page of the book, The End of History of the Last Man, a strange individual emerges and his name is Donald Trump. And basically the question that Fukuyama is asking is, are people like him fine with the fact that they're kind of a business celebrities, or are they going to work for something more? And I do believe this is an interesting story because this idea of the end of history means that future has arrived. And particularly for Eastern Europe, and I have experienced this firsthand, suddenly future from a place in time became a place in geography. The future of Poland was Germany. And this is why, if you want to live to the future, you can wait while your country is going to join European Union, or you can go dramatically to the European Union. You cannot imagine that during the Bolshevik Revolution, Trotsky will go on a fellowship to Oxford. But many of the people who very much identified with the 1989 revolutions, this is exactly what they did. Because what revolutionaries always want is to live in the future. And if basically living in the future means moving to the West, let's do it. So, this kind of idea of the arrival of the future in 1989 was the first disappearance of the future. And then suddenly, in the last decade, we ended up with the idea there is no future. The only thing that we see is kind of a dystopian scenarios which are rivaling each other's.
The other thing that I remember about Fukuyama's book, The End of History, the book, not the article, because as you say, the article, which is in itself is a very interesting piece of writing because it anticipates various events, but they're not bland, peaceful events. It anticipates dramatic happenings in the Middle East. It anticipates the possibility of a coup in the Soviet Union. It doesn't look like the end of history. But the book, which is 3 years later, it has sections in it about the places that Fukuyama think embody a version of the future. And there are two in particular. The European Union is one, and Japan is the other. And he sees these two, not the United States, he sees these two as a version of the future that might be awaiting us, which is a future in which nothing happens, essentially, because these two societies, he thought, might just get stuck in the sense that things might happen. And I think it's actually quite prophetic about Japan more than it is about the European Union. The Japanese bubble burst, Japan that seemed to be the future in one sense, all those books that were written at the end of the 80s in America. The Japanese are coming, they're buying up Hollywood, they're buying up New York. The 21st century is going to be the Japanese century. Fukuyama didn't think that, I think. But he did believe that even if the bubble bursts, Japan, it's such a comfortable society, it's an aging society, it's a stable society. It might just carry on almost unchanging. Now, obviously, it's not unchanging in technological terms, but in political terms, cultural terms. And the word I think he would use for it is that it was a bit boring, that prospect of the future. But the European Union was his other example of this. The European Union, I think, hasn't quite played out in that way. But it was a possible future in which not nothing happens, but as you say, revolution is impossible. Consumerism carries on its merry way. The stakes are much lower. But even there, even in the Japanese and the European case, the implication is some people will not be happy with this. Doesn't need to be Donald Trump. Some people will think this is not what it means to be human, because to be human is to project yourself forward in a different way, to glory, to risk, to hazard, upside and downside. And in some ways, I think the book, The End of History, surprisingly, is actually quite prophetic.
And listen, on this also Kozev was Kozev was extremely prophetic because he didn't like society that he's talking about. And by the way, he didn't like the society that he was building, working for the European project as being a high bureaucrat in the French government. Because according to him, paradoxically, the end of history is the return to a kind of a animal world in which humans are not ready to sacrifice their life anymore for anything. And this problem of consumer society is really interesting because one of the interesting things about humanity and human destiny was this drive for glory is destructive and could be self-destructive, but it was very distinctive. There was these beautiful writings about why we like so much Iliada. Because the humans, of course, are just toys in the hands of the old Greek gods, but at the same time, the humans have one thing that not gods have, and this is they're brave. And they're brave because they can sacrifice their lives. They can die for something, and the immortal gods cannot die. And because of it, they cannot be brave, they cannot be courageous. And I had the feeling that this idea of stability is interesting because Kozev was very much kind of fascinated with Japan because he said they managed to ritualize in the way the idea of sacrifice. So while they have a totally consumer society, they still pretend that they're keeping something of this former heroic tradition. And I find this very, very important because, like you, I have the feeling that we're misreading Fukuyama. This idea of the arrival of the post heroic societies was perceived first as a good news and not so good news, as a troubling news. And now we are seeing part of it and this kind of return to the idea of glory in its different kind of embodiment is something that we're dealing with.
I want to go back to what you said about the essential feature of democracy when it's working is the belief that you can essentially correct for the mistakes of the present and that you always get a second chance. Democracy is the politics of second chances. One of the other things that Tocqueville said is democracies make more mistakes than other systems of government and they correct more mistakes than other systems of government. They aren't the system that doesn't make mistakes, but the mistakes happen on much shorter time horizons because there's always an opportunity to correct. So, one way in which democracy imagines the future is the place where you correct for the mistakes of the present. And elections are absolutely geared around that. We get rid of this lot because they screwed up, and we hope that this lot does better. But also related to what we're talking about, the other thing that underpins, certainly, I think, post Second World War, late 20th century democracy is the idea of steady progress. So it's two things that might have changed here. As you say, the foreclosing of the future makes the idea that we have time to correct harder to believe. So there's a panic around elections. Maybe they'll win this one and it will be, quote unquote, the last election. But no one really believes in the idea of steady progress anymore. So that earlier version of the French story that I was describing, it was Les Trente Glorieuses, right? It was the years of steadiest growth in Europe in its history. China went through something similar after 1990, from 45 to 75 in France. You absolutely could believe that next year there would be more stuff in the shops and you would be slightly better off, and that your kids would be better off than you. So it feels to me like two things have become unglued from the idea of democracy, not just the time to correct, but also, as you were suggesting, the projections are not towards progress. Many of the projections are towards something else. And I almost feel that it's the combination of those two things that is so destabilizing. It's almost democracy might be able to survive losing one or the other. If you believe in steady economic progress, it might not matter so much this election, even if you think time is short. Or if you don't believe in steady economic progress, but you believe that there is time for you to come back and do your thing, it's the loss of both of them that is so destabilizing.
And it's something interesting happening with how you experience time in this type of democracy in crisis. On one level, everything is happening very fast. On the other, you have the feeling that nothing really important for you is happening. You are changing governments in Bulgaria. We're doing this quite a lot. For example, for the last 5 years, we have 7 or 8 parliamentary elections, and everything is changing and nothing is changing. And this story that if there is a change, this change is not driven by you. And this is about projection. By the way, this is about technologies. And if now we talk about AI as kind of doing things for us and beyond us, people had the feeling, and this is why also they don't believe that you are politically represented, because political representation always is very much, do you have the feeling that you're living in the same time? Do you have the feeling what we're really representing, in my view, is not interests or values only. We're representing experiences. And here, for me, following your major argument, because I agree with you that there was this both dimension of change of the idea of the future, very important, is how we start to compare life. Normally, you compare life to your parents. And paradoxically, when basically modernity in 50s, 60s, 70s started to speed up, we started to compare our lives to our kids, and our kids were going to do better. And the first thing happened, for example, already 15 years ago, when talking about France, French student went on these protests. And if in 1968 they were shouting, I don't want to live like my parents, now they said, no, I want to live like my parents.
Apart from anything else, I want pensions to be preserved.
I want the pensions, I want everything that they had been enjoying. And in my view, this is very important. And then suddenly also, because of social media, you start to make a comparisons not so much in the frame of your own society, but you start to compare with everywhere. I want to live like basically the most powerful and the richest people in the world. Why I don't have this? Why don't I have that? And even the idea of the social mobility is changing dramatically. I'm always going to remember in 1980s they had these global value surveys, and there was this question about happiness. And Kenyans or Nigerians, I don't remember which of the two nations, was as happy as West Germans. there was no correlation between economic development and happiness. 20 years later, they were as happy as their GDP is going to predict. And one of the major reasons is what has happened in these 20 years is that suddenly Africans got a TV screen. They see how others are living. And they're not comparing their life anymore with their parents. An African doctor has all reasons to compare their life with the life of doctors in a much more prosperous countries. And I do believe this change of comparison is critically important of how also globalization worked. We're talking a lot about kind of movements of ideas, movement of capital, and so on. But it's also a kind of movement of comparisons. You suddenly start to compare yourself to somebody you were never going to compare yourself 20 years ago.
Just to finish this part of the conversation, because we're going to go on and talk about the future of the future. But can I ask you about your personal experience of that? The Ivan Krastev version of the Annie Ernaux story, growing up in Bulgaria, because after all, you must have lived through a version of it, both access to how other people lived, and then through the late 1980s into the 1990s, the political transformation, which was initially experienced as a shock, creating a very different way of thinking about the future. Did you experience those two things as shocks in a sense? Can you remember the experience of, as it were, seeing how other people lived and it changing how you thought about time and the future? Can you remember what was your experience of the post 1989 shock?
For sure. And listen, I was in a kind of a very privileged position because I was 25-year-old in 1990. And in 1990, basically being young and speaking some English, or what you believe is English, was very important. And the most important thing that I remember was that suddenly time started running. On Friday, you cannot understand anymore what you have been thinking on Monday. Now we are telling this story as a kind of a stories of, oh, people simply they want to go here and there. But people are changing their views dramatically and not necessarily simply in a conformist way. One of the things of the acceleration of time is that it is not simply pushing you to think differently, it is changing you. In February 1990, if I remember, was the first independent opinion poll being done in Bulgaria. More than 70% of the Bulgarians claimed that they are ready to sacrifice their life for socialism. 6 months later, majority of the Bulgarians, so a big plurality, wanted to ban the Communist Party. You can say that, oh, this is just too kind of a conformist story, but it's not. People suddenly are seeing the world differently, changing things differently, doing things differently. And this cannot be perceived as authentic, seen from outside, but seen from inside. This is what was happening. And then also, this big change was creating such an openings and positions that were impossible. I was recently told a personal story of somebody which I found is really great and explaining best why East Germans are probably the most unhappy people of everybody of the former Eastern Bloc. And the story was somebody was telling me the story of the current German ambassador in France. So, as you know, there was for several months a non-communist government being elected, and the first and last free elections in GDR after the fall of the wall. And there was a person, 27-year-old, coming from a Protestant family, very much a dissident. And because he spoke French, the new government decided that he should be appointed the ambassador to France. And he went to France to become the ambassador of the GDR, but while probably he was traveling, the country disappeared. So he had to go back. And he went and started his career in the now Unified Germany's foreign ministry. So 35 years later, he ends up as the German ambassador to France. And when he went to the president, he gave him basically two documents, one that he has from 35 years ago. And I find this very important because if he was in Bulgaria, Poland, Hungary, any of East European countries, Baltic republics, most probably he was going to be an ambassador at 27. He was going to be a minister in 35. There was a great generational opening for all of us. And in a certain way, the problem with these first years of transition is that it was like you're always betting on a number. There is no red or black. You're either losing big or you're winning big, because also many lives have been destroyed. Many careers have been destroyed. Many people were not in a position to benefit from the change. And I believe this kind of a moment of a dramatic change where life are changing, life strategies are changing, and also the identity of the people are changing. This is things that when basically some processes started in the United States, particularly after President Trump came back to power, I had the feeling that there was a difference between Eastern Europe and the Western Europe when we're looking at the United States. In Western Europe, my sense was that people have been scared because they have the feeling that they don't understand what is going on. In Eastern Europe, to the way we were scared because we had the feeling that we know what was going on.
And you remember it in a way.
We remember it simply. This was part of our personal experience.
You were 25 in 1990. Can you remember as a child, as a teenager, when you were at school, did you have a feeling that future was coming? Or did it come more or less out of the blue? Was the experience that you had, say, when you were 15 at school in Bulgaria under the old regime, of a completely different relationship with the future to the one that you had when you were 25?
Oh, yeah, totally. When I was 15 in Bulgaria, I had the feeling that communism was as stable as nature. And anytime you're projecting your own life, you're projecting this within the communist system. And this was going even when you were 18, when you were 20. Of course, we benefited from something very important, and this was that, and I now appreciate it much more than I could have appreciated back then. Better to be a young person in a closed society that is opening than being a young person in an open society that is closing. After Gorbachev came to power in 1985, suddenly for our generation, and I was just entering university, every year something that was not possible yesterday was becoming possible. So we have been very much socialized in the university years of our life with the idea of great openness of possibilities. It could be real, it could be illusionary, but this was how we were there. But otherwise, to believe that in 15 years you're going to imagine that the regime is collapsing and so on, many people who are going to say that the regime is going to collapse, it was much more moral judgment, how they feel about it, than the real hope that they were going to do it. And I'm always going to remember something by accident on the very night in which communist leader Todor Zhivkov basically resigned as the leader of the Communist Party. There was a famous restaurant in Sofia University where students and professors are meeting and talking and drinking. And at this night in the restaurant, on the table in which I happened to be, was also the person who just 9 months later is going to become the first non-communist president of Bulgaria. So he was sitting on this table talking to friends, and there was some younger people like me, and he looked and said, "Do you know what? I do believe that in your lifetime you're going to see the end of communism." It was November 1989. It was the 10th of November. So from this point of view, even for somebody who was in opposition all his life, who was a dissident, who basically was going to become in opposition in a week, the collapse of the communism was still a very distant future. So this idea of the future being close, being far away, was incredibly important. And so to believe that everybody knew that the regime is collapsing and so on, these are reconstructions, type of reconstructions that we normally do about many things in our life, but it is not basically, at least how I remember, most of the people experienced it.
That was part one of a two-part conversation. And next time, I'm talking to Ivan about the future of the future. Where are we going with our ideas of the future? And what are we going to do if we don't believe that the future really exists for us? Do join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future.